Okay, welcome back. This is Reading at Home with Holmes. I believe this is chapter 9, therefore it is part 9. That's how that works. Um, Macy, we had Valley last time who did a beautiful job reading, and we assigned him, meaning Matthew assigned him the summary. But as he couldn't be here today, I believe he gave it to Macy, who will read it on behalf of him.
Uh, Give me a minute. So far, what I got from Valley's summary, because again, this is kind of his, so I'm going to be trying to play with another person's mind, which is not here. Um, he talked about last time how we talked about Aristotle as depicted by Gilchrist as being a true scientist, and we um, we he kind of describes it as capturing the narrative in that sense, where it's like um, you have to pay attention to who it is that you're, I guess, idolizing or looking towards. And then that reminds me of during that, we were kind of saying that just because these individuals are had potentially malicious intent in their own um, journey, it doesn't mean that, again, the four truth, one lie, it doesn't mean that what they had to say was necessarily always wrong given different contexts. Maybe not the context they were thinking of, but given different contexts, it could have its validity. So when Gilchrist was referring to Aristotle as a true scientist, it was during the time when he was saying that um, according to his interpretation, Gilchrist, of Aristotle, he saw Aristotle as the type of person who was a scientist according to actual like observation of like the lived experience in the incarnate world. And if that's the case, then we can definitely say, sure, that's very right hemispheric, right? But then we have our historical context as to why we actually would say Aristotle's philosophy showed more of the opposite of that. But the pattern that Gilchrist is trying to paint might be still true, even if he used kind of the wrong person for it. Um, and then Valley wrote down that we were doing a critiquing of Gilchrist in the sense of Plato's Republic being not literal. So when we were talking about that last time, for people who have and watched that, we were talking about the fact that Gilchrist, again, this was the last segment where we posed a lot of our critiques onto him because, and our counter arguments onto his work, because he was portraying Plato's Republic almost too much and too closely to Plato himself and how Plato thought. But
Mm.
that was just a thought experiment that Plato during that time had to give his students in order to get them to think about, oh, is this a good idea? Because the Republic is very fascist. And then it's like, well, that's a thought experiment. It's no, it's not a good idea, but how and in what way and how can you prove that? But in the overall of, again, the pattern that Gilchrist was trying to show and demonstrate still is accurate in the sense of the Republic is a very left hemispheric way of looking at a society. So yes, you're not wrong that that is what it would look like. And then he says the left hemisphere formalizing creates stasis, which I feel like that's pretty explanatory in terms of what it is that we've been talking about. Last time we touched on I can never say it right, physiognomy, basically the study of the expressions of the face. And if I'm not mistaken, last time it also played into the different cultures and how they kind of did different levels of portraiture and art. And so that was explored in the last one. And then it says, we need to do more of this. We need to acknowledge when we have unbridled left brain systematization of thinking to society. This is what it looks like to he put fumble fudge your way through. I think we know what that means. And then he then put that if you can understand your ability to also be understand your own left hemisphere, then it can help you in what he put as quotation marks, your ability to save the world. So that is Valley's little interpretation. If I butchered that, I apologize.
Yeah, that was good. For anybody who hasn't been keeping up, last was the second half of chapter 8, because it was a large chapter to get through. And this one I'm actually excited about. And I say actually because when I started it, it covers the Renaissance, the Reformation, a little bit of the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and it starts painting this picture about hemisphere shifts and pendulum swinging to each hemisphere over cycles of our history. And he brings a lot of the cultural movements at the time, which makes sense. So he brings a lot of poets of each era into it to explain um, his pattern recognition of the hemispheres. And I was, I guess, because my second time reading, it's like the fourth for dad and stuff like that. So kind of starting with it, he's talking about these artists and the poets and their hemispheres playing out via their work. I'm like, okay, where is this going? Is kind of how I started the first half of the chapter. Um, and it progressively got better though as it got on. And I'm excited particularly because Dad, you just finished Peterson's We Who Wrestle with God. And he brings in a lot of the religious, because it's the Reformation, which I didn't know entirely what that meant before reading this, and now I have a better idea. And because you just finished reading that, you'll be able to tie in some of the religious philosophy that he's kind of building and painting about how it shifts in terms of the hemispheres. So I'm excited. And even Nate has emailed me regarding the Reformation. So we have the right people here and the right context to start really meshing this out.
I got the
Um,
Reformation down.
Great.
I
So,
know. Kidding.
okay.
Come on.
As everybody knows the deal, if you have, I know Kyle, you like to write highlights in your book. If you have any that are relevant to either what I bring up or just in the conversation, bring it in. I've already told Macy this. It helps me ping and bring up more relevant because as everybody knows, I like to screenshot over 50% of the entire chapter. So sometimes I don't know what to bring up, but as the conversation flows and as people bring in things, it just helps me paint a better podcast for everybody's viewing. But to just jump into the intro, the Renaissance and the Reformation, I have about two screenshots here where it kind of just, again, paints the picture about where we're going. So I will begin reading if anybody has objections, and then I'll call on people if nobody volunteers themselves as we go on. The period of perhaps 700 years that used to be known as the Dark Ages, between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and what we now think of as the early Renaissance in the 12th, was by no means as lacking in vitality and color as the name implied. That the term has fallen into disuse may be a recognition of the often remarkable quality of craftsmanship evident in what has survived from the period, or of the fact that it is no longer dark in the sense that we know little about it. Modern historiography has seen to that, and might also be due to its pejorative flavor. Yet it would surely be a brave person who challenged the idea that the Renaissance was a remarkable, indeed unparalleled step forward in the history of civilization, akin to the developments of 6th century Athens, in comparison with which the Dark Ages, whatever their merits, pale, relatively speaking, in significance. In the next few chapters, I am inevitably going to have to use some much debated terms such as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and Romanticism. To the left hemisphere, these look like categories that should be definable. To the right hemisphere, they are the products of experience of loose constellations of phenomena which have a family resemblance. Conventionally, at this point, I should refer to a renewed interest with the coming of the Renaissance in the world at large, a thirst for knowledge of the natural world and the historical world, the broader context in which we live, with the accent on how things are rather than how they ought in theory to be or are according to authority. The beginnings of modern science, history, and philosophy. In the arts, it is usual to speak of the new sense of the importance of harmony, of the relation of part to whole, a new spirit of conception that is both daring and tactful, graceful, yet original. In all things, we learn, there was a new sense of the balanced reciprocities of individual and society, of male and female. It is often said that it is in the Renaissance that the recognizably modern Western world begins, but of course, it is more complicated than that. That said, it might well look as if the Renaissance was the next great insurgence of the right hemisphere, perhaps even more pronounced than that of the ancient world. But that too is an oversimplification. Once again, there seems to have been a standing back, but this time a more self-conscious standing back than in 6th century BC Athens. After all, from the outset, there is a self-conscious retrospection towards that ancient world, a second level of self-consciousness. In view of the extended metaphor in the first part of the book, in which I related the activity of the frontal lobes to the ability to rise above the terrain, enabling the left hemisphere to see the world laid out as its territory, it is perhaps significant that one of the first great Renaissance writers, Petrarch, is also said to have been the first person to think of climbing a hill for the view. But it is striking that what he reports is not the utility of the experience, but its beauty. This illustrates a feature of this turning points in Western civilization, that they begin as symmetrical. The standing back is, if one can put it that way, in itself hemisphere neutral, a function of the bilateral frontal lobes. But once again, the fact of standing back necessitates a sharpening of the division of labor, a demand for abstraction and generalization, favoring the left hemisphere. And at the same time, it generates a leap forward in the right hemisphere's relation with the world around it, to which it now stands in a deepened and enriched relationship through the achievement of what I have called necessary distance. Petrarch's view suggests an opening of the eyes. He saw what was there for all to see, but none had seen. This is a Renaissance characteristic, a sudden coming into awareness of aspects of experience that had unaccountably been neglected. In science, a return to looking at things carefully as they are, rather than they were known to be. In painting, similarly, to what we see rather than what we know. This is bound up with the important rediscovery of perspective. It used to be thought that this was a Renaissance invention, but it is clear that it was understood by late Greek painters, and in particular can be seen in Roman wall paintings. But the faculty had been lost for over 1,000 years until the time of Giotto in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, who is often said to have been the first Renaissance painter to employ perspective. It was taken further in the paintings of Masaccio after Brunelleschi's demonstrated practical perspective in the piazza of the Duomo in Florence in 1415. When he's alluding to the paintings here, he does a lot on art and he gives some visuals. So even here, he tries, this is, as he describes it, Bishop blessing annual fair from medieval vellum. Size represents what we know, not what we see. So the difference of seeing a portion of the town or seeing, because we can only see a portion when we look at something, versus painting the entire house like a blueprint, because we know hypothetically what the whole town looks like, as is demonstrated here. Meanwhile, that's not what we physically experience. And then he talks later about physical examples in art being, we paint in earlier paintings, including bones. in people because we know we have bones, but when you look at a person, you don't see through them and you do not see their bones. So it's the difference between painting what we theoretically know versus what we actually experience in the real world. And there's this big shift in doing that in art, poetry in the Renaissance. Yeah, I screenshotted what he says right here, just a short paragraph to again the overall picture. In the first part of this book, I have referred to the fact that depth relies principally on the right hemisphere. Each hemisphere, however, has its contribution to make to perspective. Perspectival space is also related to individuality, another classic element of the Renaissance worldview, since perspective mediates a view of the world from an individual standpoint, one particular place at one particular time, rather than a God's eye view from nowhere. Like individuality, however, perspective is understood differently by the two hemispheres. Perspective is, on the one hand, the means of relating the individual to the world and enormously enhancing the sense of the individual as standing within the world, where depth includes and even draws in the viewer through the pull of the imagination. And on the other hand, a means of turning the individual into an observing eye, a geometer coolly detached from his object space. Equally, the rise of the sense of the individual as distinct from the society to which he belongs enables both an understanding of others as individuals with feelings exactly like one's own and grounds of empathy, and at the same time, a detachment of the individual from the world around him that leads ominously in the direction of autism. Subconsciously, I realized I did the left hand for the right hemisphere's perspective, and then I did the right for the left hemisphere. That was fun. Um, I know it's silly little things. I'm reading 1984 right now, and I know I'm supposed to see the geopolitics connection, but I just can't help but see the hemispheres. It's kind of one of those.
Do you when you read 1984, do you have a sense of the bleakness, the mood, the atmosphere that he writes? Do you enjoy that, or are you more looking at it from a parsing out information?
I think all of the above. I mean, I absorb it as its entirety, and then I know as I'll talk with it with Dad, and then me and Macy were talking about it today. Then some of the breaking down and analyzing comes afterwards, where some of the geopolitics in relation to also even his own context as the writer, George Orwell, which I didn't know was a like a fake name. His real name is Eric something or rather. I didn't.
Claire, he's actually he's part of the elite circles.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one thing a lot of people don't know. And the one I'm reading is, or I'm listening. I'm on audio, and it's by Stephen Fry is the one who reads it, and he gives a little bit of an introduction, exposing the fact and saying that he was a Navy agent on behalf of the Imperial British Empire, which not a lot of people know. So I thought that was definitely.
Yeah, Matthew Ehret talks about that, how when he was in India, he was doing some pretty heinous things.
Mm-hmm. I guess on the topic of some of the oblique emotionalism, there are he brings in again this in the Renaissance, this connection of melancholy in relation to the right hemisphere, calling it a right hemisphere movement, the Renaissance. The right hemisphere is very closely associated with melancholy and for no particular reason, and yet there is a reason. And I liked that there's some nuance in this whole chapter because not only does he bring up Aristotle again, he brings up Plato in a light where it's not a criticism. And then he talks about people like Francis Bacon, who supposedly Leibniz had a criticism of. And he also brings up Heidegger again and a fellow named Luther. And he talks about where Macy was saying on the edge of a knife, where they were walking the line. And he talks about how even people in past the Reformation, just before the Enlightenment, they were walking the line of having the hemisphere synthesis, but they were aware of their own imbalance, just closely, almost too far to one hemisphere or the other, how they could recognize in themselves that they were doing this thing in and amongst the culture doing the thing. So he was talking about how there was a mix of emotion, how sadness at one point being just straight sadness and then happiness, how in the Renaissance there was a conglomerate. They would almost become not necessarily one, but mixed feelings became irregular. It wasn't as simple as I feel this way or this way. It's like I feel complicated. I feel both, which I know to Matthew, Matthew has talked about kind of that pain is pleasure, pleasure is pain, and how he doesn't like that because the oligarchs will use that, that in, an itch, you're technically, you're scratching yourself. So that's pain, but you feel ease because it's an itch. So now you're relieved. And he's like, the postmodernists and the relativists would take that and see, it's objective or subjective. Sorry, it's totally subjective. And pleasure can be pain and pain can be pleasure. There's a fine line. The right thing that they did say is there is a fine line, because most things are ratios. It's that again, that 4-to-1 rule that creeps in, even though Matthew reading it would go mixed feelings. Maybe that could get manipulated, which it absolutely can. Though that doesn't mean that it should be completely discarded. So, and again, Mace, if you have something based off of the conversation, do just jump in. I was going off of Nathan, kind of inspired he talked about the melancholy mood, and now I'm here.
Some of the poetry in here is just, I mean, it's just fantastic, isn't it?
Who wants to read for me? Because my voice is tired.
Where are you starting from?
Oh, okay. Well, here. One of the most mysterious.
Okay. Well, I'll read it because you guys probably read to each other all the time.
Thanks,
Right?
Nate. That's very true.
One of the most mysterious expressions of the way in which the whole does not depend on the sum of the parts is in the art of caricature. Here, gross distortions of every part can be compatible with immediate recognition of the whole. Caricature in the ancient world, and it existed both in Egypt and Greece, was always the exaggeration of a type, not the caricature of an individual. The first artist to deploy caricature of an individual and the originator of the term caricatura was Annibale Carracci, 1560 to 1609. A good caricature, he said, like every work of art, is more true to life than reality itself. The genius of caricature is, as Gombrich and Chris point out, to have revealed that similarity is not essential to likeness. Carracci portrayed his friends and fellow creatures as animals. There the artist changes every feature, every single part of the face. All he retains is the striking and individual expression, which remains unaltered even when it is transferred to another creature. To recognize such similarity in different shapes gives us all a shock of surprise to which we respond with laughter. The caricaturist's magic work, they comment, is still somewhat akin to black magic. From the earliest, all the Renaissance arts showed a newfound expressiveness, a delicacy of feeling, which can be heard as early as the troubadour songs of Adam de la Halle, or in the love poetry of Christine de Pizan. In the visual arts, this was manifest from Giotto onwards in a preoccupation with the expressive powers of the human face, in particular, which can be seen in Masaccio or Gozzilli, even in group scenes, where it might be thought less important. It will be remembered that the researches of Hufschmidt, Grusser, Lotto, and others revealed that during the Renaissance, there was a peak in left-facing, right hemisphere favoring profiles in portraiture. In keeping with my view that the Renaissance initially involves a standing forth of the right hemisphere, it seems that from the 14th century onwards, there begins a tendency for the light source in paintings to be situated in the left visual field. This tendency increased during the Renaissance and declined from the 18th century onwards. During the 20th century, the medieval tendency for a non-directional light source returned, a change which was to be correlated with the disappearance of apparent depth, illusionary perspective, and the tendency of the artists to remain in the two-dimensional plane. It should be noted that the wall paintings of Pompeii and Herculaneum earlier in the first century AD also exhibit a left dominance in light direction, as do the Byzantine mosaics in the churches of Ravenna. Intriguingly, there appears to have been a marked shift, according to James Hall, in the way the left and right sides of the body were viewed around this time. The traditional view of the left side as literally sinister would appear to have softened at the Renaissance and given way to an intuitive sense of its positive qualities. According to Hall, the superior beauty of the left hand was an important component of the courtly love tradition, right at the outset of the Renaissance. As the Renaissance unfolded, the claims of the left side were advanced at the expense of the right. It was seen as the more beautiful side, finer, more gentle, more truthful, more in touch with feeling. The entire left side of the body took on a cast of beauty, truthfulness, and fragility. Given that it was centuries too early for these views to be influenced by knowledge of hemisphere differences, it looks like another possible instance of the brain intuitively cognizing itself. In music, there was an astonishing efflorescence of polyphony, with an emphasis on highly expressive melodic lines and above all, for the first time, complex harmony, including false relations and suspensions and the relationship of the parts to the whole. Though there is unquestionably much joyful music of the Renaissance, its greatest productions are melancholy in nature, the requiems, and the great devotional works associated with Passiontide, and in the secular realm, its lute songs and madrigals celebrating love that is occasionally requited. They can, of course, also be very funny, and wit and humor are also prominent features, often self-mocking of nature of poetry, music, and painting in this period. Melancholy in the 6th century was commonly associated with wit, intelligence, wisdom, and judiciousness, in a tradition that culminated in, rather than merely being derived from, Burton. In her book on the history of melancholy, Jennifer Radin notes that for the Renaissance writers of Aristotle's view, that in certain thoughtful temperaments, groundless melancholy sometimes ran deep, introduced a theme of emphasizing that the fear and sadness of melancholy are without cause. Radin's italics. She notes that emphasis on the groundless nature of the fear and sadness of melancholia declined in the 18th century, but it returned in 19th century analysis. This uncaused melancholy was the evidence of a thoughtful nature that can be found in Shakespeare, when Antonio, in the opening lines of The Merchant of Venice, is made to say, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me. You say it wearies you. But how caught it, found it, or came by it? What stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am learned." I suggest that the melancholy of the period, which is also a feature of its music and poetry, is an aspect of the dominance at the time of the right hemisphere world. An emphasis on uncausedness is designed to make the point that it is not merely a limited, inexplicable reaction to an event, or a chain of events, or a state of affairs in the visible world of any kind, but it is intrinsic to a certain way of being in the world that was emerging at the time. The fact that this ceased to obtain during the 18th century and reemerged in the 19th is consistent, what I shall be contending in later chapters. William James, the greatest psychologist ever to have studied religion, sympathetically wrote that melancholy constitutes an essential moment in every complete religious evolution, and that the completest religions are those in which pessimism has been best developed. There is at least a strong connection between religious belief and melancholic temperament in the Renaissance period, as between music and melancholy. The connection between music and religion is a universal in all cultures and at all times. I would see these interconnected phenomena as necessarily related, given the right hemisphere's predominance in each of them and the relative prominence of the world according to the right hemisphere at this time. An interesting study could be made of the place of tears in the art of poetry of the period, in the plays of Shakespeare, in the songs of Dowland and his contemporaries, and with greater detachment, in an almost bizarre dryness, in the poems of Donne. Of Marvell, the tears do come, sad, slowly, dropping like a gum. Of Crawshaw, whose every poem is filled with tears, whose watery diamonds, those portable and compendious oceans, where they inevitably form implicit and almost illicit bridges between secular and religious devotion. The Renaissance is also the time when not just apparently opposed or contradictory ideas could be entertained together, when not just ambiguity and multiplicity of meaning in language are rife, from the obvious love for puns, conceits, and so on, to the whole array of fruitful ambiguities in which Elizabethan poetry inheres and consists, but when emotions are experienced as characteristically mixed. Although Metrodorus anciently said that there is something akin to pleasure in sadness, mixed emotions were not commonly appreciated in the ancient world. Seneca thought the idea quite immoral, and that sadness and pleasure intermingle was hardly accepted till the Renaissance.
I think that's pretty much where I stopped my screenshot. Want more? Read the book.
I feel like we almost did. That was a long screenshot.
Sorry. No, but that was a lot of context to explain even the melancholy and then in conjunction with the pleasure, because when people, he talked earlier in part one of the book, how people get sad listening to beautiful songs. They'll describe the sadness as beautiful, which sounds contradictory. And me and Macy watched a show recently on Jane Austen, and she talked about irony. There was a law fellow, and he said irony is offense with a smile. And then she said, no, irony is the coming together of two contradictory truths, and the coming together creates another truth in of itself, which reminds me of this, because this beauty in pain, it's as we know, it gets manipulated for the hedonism of the oligarchs and of the cults that Matthew has taught us on the Rising Tide Foundation. There's still, it comes from a part truth. It's same with the post, and I think he talks about that later too. The subversion of, I guess we'll go there next, the subversion of Heidegger and Luther. He said they started with very right hemisphere concerns. Even he said the Reformation, he said it started with the pursuit. It was a fear of inauthenticity. They wanted to pursue more authenticity. So they thought traditions and rituals, why worship, a statue? Or he talked about bread and wine symbolizing the body and blood of Christ. And this to them was inauthentic because it's bread and wine. It's not legitimately the blood and body of Christ, but we really believe in the blood and body of Christ. So this re-representation is inauthentic to the true God. So then they did away with it. So
Well, I comment on that. If one of the things about people about trauma is that you're going to get emotional in your
mm,
body, all because that the emotions are kept in the body. They're going to come up, and so if you're opening up, you're going to get emotional. Well, you guys already know this, right? But the thing is that it's so necessary for self development. But
mhm.
in the Reformation, they considered a lot of those emotions coming from the body as dangerous, and they didn't want that
A
to.
big part of so a lot that's been talked about here. I think that one of the things that kind of gets lost when looking at it is the left hemisphere is going to make a presumption of the necessary need for reconciliation on the paradox, whereas the right hemisphere is very not just very content. It implicitly doesn't concern itself with reconciliation on that matter. I don't mean reconciling as in like say sorry when you've done something wrong and try to bridge relationships. Right. When a paradox is presented, because of context being the realm of the right hemisphere, time is the teller of all truth, and it instinctively knows this. So it doesn't concern itself with, I guess, it should be aware that it's going to get subverted by the left hemisphere instantly. Like instantly. The minute that the right hemisphere goes and out and stays open to that which can be and is possibility, which poetry is that realm. Many of even these writers, because like even when you look at Heidegger or William James, the father of psychology. I mean, when you actually look, the guy was an occultist. Okay, so let's just call the guy for what he was. This was an individual that was already set into motion to design and usurp for social engineering purposes and to try to get back into the right hand and the left hand, which you can actually find several times even throughout the Bible. So this also lets you know that even the cultists, even under the Treaty of Nicaea, were still undermining certain facets of the biblical corpus. But in there along the way was the foundations that the right hemisphere knows instinctively as the pursuit of God and doesn't worry about delineation and the idiosyncratic specifics of the pursuit of God. But what will happen the minute the awe of an irreconcilable or a paradox or an irony shows up, as forementioned earlier in the discussion, climb the mountain for the view, left hemisphere would look and do a calculation. Is it worth it? Like, could the view possibly, what will the view offer me? What could I see that would be beneficial? Whereas the right hemisphere would be willing to make the pursuit for the lay of the land of the experience of what's it going to mean to climb? What's going to be different once I'm there? What's going to be like, everything's almost like a questioning and a willingness to go and pursue the question because the question exists. And the left hemisphere will then run the necessary, and it is necessary. This is once again, like, we're not here to beat on the left hemisphere. We're here to understand how important it is to manage God's most precious gift to us, so to speak, and that is your mind, the most important part of even trying to develop the poetry of that relationship. And that's what you see written throughout all of even what the Renaissance is. It's imagine, if you will, an era of humanity where you're finding yourself coming out of the tyranny of what the left hemisphere brought about as a result. And now the intentions of a collective humanity, in particular the regions, because even during the Dark Ages, we had, I think, Thomas Cahill's How the Irish Saved Civilization. Like the right hemisphere, you don't murder the right hemisphere. As much as the left hemisphere goes out of its way to kill left hemispheres, that's just killing human beings. And so therefore it's doing a mathematical reduction of the people.
Even the left hemisphere goes out of its way to kill the right hemisphere.
The left hemisphere goes out of its way to kill the right hemisphere. Yeah. And the thing is that because it's a simple formula to the left hemisphere of utility. It's I can only be subverted by a certain percentage of right hemisphere thinkers in the world. So if we just eliminate cultures or anything that could be in the way of that pursuit, then the odds are my will be done instead of the whole God dynamic of thy will. In other words, away from me, and I am also in relation to. Mm-hmm. So this is the Renaissance is like the birthing of almost like a pendulum going the other way. And so you had like, because you have to consider the culture that got you the Renaissance. Like you're downstream of a whole, like even when you looked at that painting that was mentioned earlier, where the center of it was the steeple, there was a bishop character, right? And a majority of the faces were looking in one direction in contrast to the other. And you could see a difference in how the faces were even painted, basically depending on which side profile that you were given. And then of course the church, a little bit of markets, and then there was dwelling places, a little bit of sheep. And the plebs' houses got smaller the further away from the center, and the church was and that doesn't mean that all individuals looked at the church and went like, it's the end all be all. What the church was the most authoritative structure in the lives of those that were alive, leading from Dark Ages into the Renaissance. Go ahead.
Okay, but he posited that there was a sort of a more of a balance in the bilateral relationship between the hemispheres and the dark.
A balance. Balance doesn't mean 50-50. If that's the one thing I learned about this book. And when everybody hears balance of the hemispheres, they think 50-50. As we now know, it should more be 70-30 is how it should really be.
Yeah.
So, and he says that with the Renaissance, it is more of a shift towards the right, having it 70. And then it progressively, as we approach the Reformation, and then
Right. Yep.
As we get to the Enlightenment,
it immediately gets hijacked, actually. So that's the intriguing part, is that when you look at the timeline of the Renaissance leading up to the Reformation, when you think about it in human years of us doing an evolution of our own, even cognitive awareness, the hemisphere is becoming even more self-aware, and then by even just relationship aware of others, that consideration gets hijacked as fast as you can say lickety split.
He talked about the seed of it being a sense of individuality growing out of the Renaissance.
Yeah. But he talks, there's a beautiful excerpt in this chapter where he and maybe Kyle or Macy would have it specifically. I'd have to look through my screenshots, but he talks about the left hemisphere is specialized in abstractions and generalizations. And me and Macy were talking about this the other night, because certain people, especially nowadays, like people that study psychology, they think they know people because they know the overall pattern of what they really know is demographics. They don't know people, they know demographics, and there's a difference. Demographics is categories that we fit into: men, women, middle-aged, youth, Caucasian, Asian, those are demographics. And because of certain patterns that they fall into, those psychological profilings that people do, you think you understand humanity now that you can break apart people into all of their categories and predict whether or not somebody's more likely to make a crime than another. But that's still the left hemisphere's idea of people. The right hemisphere is individuality. And the funny thing about individuality is that it's also in context to other people. The individual is also always in relation to a whole. So it understands the particular, which is the individual, and originality, but that still encompasses the entirety of humanity. It's the differences amongst a whole, whereas the left hemisphere just gets these generalizations, which is decontextualized, and people aren't decontextualized. And I don't have the specific part, but maybe we can get to that later, because it's a beautiful excerpt that you were alluding to, Nathan. Like, he has it.
Yeah. Well, Mike, Mike was I was wanting to ask Mike one more thing about because I'm kind of hijacking things a bit here.
No.
A discussion's a discussion, brother. Don't
Absolutely.
be nice to yourself.
I was like, so like, you're saying that because of the sense of differentiation and individuality started coming to the forefront, and there was a lack of unity in culture to some degree because of that, because of the economic issues and the patrons and all of that nonsense. That was an attempt by a few people to bring a unity, and a truly spiritual unity, and it was hijacked.
So when we get it's inevitable that the hijacking is going to happen because of the mode of perspective that the left hemisphere conducts itself. And because the right hemisphere has a higher aptitude of the absence of no, there is a willingness because of the potential of the left hemisphere as the right hemisphere would view the left hemisphere's results. It's kept in consideration. So now, like, we know this through like going through the first part of the book. Like, this isn't something that gets to be brought into philosophy and we get to theorize. This is actually what our brain physically does. The whole reason why now the second part of this book and why we're getting to discuss it in this matter is we are wanting to now recognize that the brain doing the physical thing that it is going to do, not regardless of our intentions, because consciousness is the byproduct of both the hemispheres. What then needs to be understood, as Madison had forementioned, is the percentage of the right hemisphere's, I guess if you want to say the will be done by the right hemisphere, not only should be, but the best versions of ourselves is when we have that percentage at that 70 to 75% ratio over left hemispheric proclivity of thinking. And the reason, one of the examples that is given with this Renaissance, Reformation, and then, it could easily be argued that from that point on, it's even difficult to have science play out with the right hemisphere at the helm, because almost quite instantly, like a term that gets used lots in today's culture is capture. Well, which hemisphere does that? Like, we already know what the left hemisphere does. Like, capture is the left hemisphere's modality. It is manipulation, it is grasping, it is structures, it is systematization. And why does it do those things? For utility. So anyways, all this to say is that as early as the signature of the right hemisphere was being recognized in the early stages of the Renaissance period, it wasn't long after, when you consider how long it took to go from Renaissance to Reformation, that you instantly saw the left hemisphere systematize, hijack. And the reason why that would be important to the left hemisphere to do that is because potential potential is elusive to the left hemisphere, and it despises pain and suffering, because that is an embodiment. It would look at pain and suffering under a utility. It would prefer for what's the saying? The ends justify the means. That is a left hemisphere statement if there's ever been one. So in other words, whatever is going to take in order to obtain the results where I am not in pain and I'm not suffering, even if I have to put that pain and suffering onto others. And it could be argued, and there's lots of evidence of that, not only just throughout this book, but also others, that the left hemisphere's sort of sadomasochistic outcomes, malevolence, as we describe it, we're using a word to describe it, is really a signature of the left hemisphere's outcome. Because the right hemisphere, I don't even believe is capable of it, to be honest. There's no evidence so far in any of the literature that we've been doing to suggest that the right hemisphere can even, it's something that the right hemisphere understands is there, but would not operate under that, because it would go entirely against its design.
On the subject of subversion, this is the part where he kind of alludes to the Reformation and why it has the signature that it does. I don't know if Dad, Macy, one of you want to read this. It's a shorter section. I only pulled up 2 screenshots so, to just get the point, and then I'm sure we'll be able to talk about it, and then I'll pull a lot more.
Okay. The Reformation. In the first chapter of part 2, I suggest there are 2 ways in which the inauthenticity of representation of the left hemisphere's world can stimulate a response. One is the tendency to redress the loss through an urgent longing for the vibrancy and freshness of the world that the right hemisphere delivers. The other is quite the opposite, a rejection of it. Since that the right hemisphere world now comes to be seen as intrinsically inauthentic and therefore as invalid. Instead of a corrective swing of the pendulum, therefore, there is a loss of homeostasis, and the result is positive feedback, whereby the left hemisphere's values simply become further entrenched, as we just previously discussed.
Hmm.
Though we have been focusing on a return to the right hemisphere in the flowering of the Renaissance, with an almost magnetic attraction towards the newly discovered history, writings, arts, and monuments of the ancient world, which opened eyes to the vibrancy of a living world beyond the medieval world picture, the decline of the Middle Ages yields an example of both processes at work. One can see the second process, a rejection of the right hemisphere's world, in the way in which the decline of metaphoric understanding of ceremony and ritual into the inauthentic reception of empty procedures in the Middle Ages prompted. Not a revitalization of metaphoric understanding, but an outright rejection of it with the advent of the Reformation. This cataclysmic convulsion is said to have begun with Luther's 95 Thesis, which he nailed to the door of the in Wittenberg in 1517. In the subsequent unfolding of events, however, Luther could be seen as a somewhat tragic figure. He was himself tolerant, conservative, his concern being for authenticity and a return to experience as opposed to reliance on authority. His attitude to the place of images in worship and in the life of the church was balanced and reasonable. His target was not images themselves, which he actually endorsed and encouraged, but precisely the functionalist abuse of images, images which he thought should be reverenced. Yet despite this, he found himself unleashing forces of destruction that were out of his control, forces which set about destroying the very things he valued, forces against which he inveighed finally without effect. Describing the fanaticism of the time, I have seen them return from hearing the sermon as if inspired by an evil spirit, wrote Erasmus. The faces of all showing a curious wrath and ferocity. There are, I think, interesting parallels with the fate of Heidegger, struggling to transcend the Cartesian subjective objective polarity, committed to the difficult business of authentic encounter with whatever is, a process requiring careful and scrupulous attention, but soon hijacked by those who wish to take his problematizing of the concept of objective truth as the signal for a free-for-all in which all values are merely relative, interpreted as meaning values have no force, in which there is no longer any objective standard of truth, interpreted as meaning no truth, and in which ultimately an anarchic destruction of everything Heidegger valued and struggled to defend was unleashed in his name. Here too, as in Luther's case, I would say the original impulse towards authenticity came from the right hemisphere, but quickly became annexed to the agenda of the left hemisphere, not by a revolutionary inversion, but by a slippage of meaning, which repays attention. Which, that signature right there, we were once asked on a show, I'm sorry to interrupt in the flow, but this is kind of important context. We were asked in an early show, but I forget how it came up, but we've got to bear in mind. Somebody said, what was the left hemisphere's greatest accomplishment? And I said sophistry. Because the playing of words it's that semantic argumentation of a verbal structure. This is why laws play out the way they do. This is why even like a lot of people think the Magna Carta was like some sort of benevolent thing that was brought to, every man's home is his castle sort of defense. It gets sold to us even in the movies, but in all actuality, it was the oligarchs trying to make sure that they protected they had the not the Great Reset, the Great Taking. Like that was an early version of the same damn thing that David Webb's work goes over when they try to put into place a series of words that then mean reality.
Yes.
That is necessary to negotiate with others,
right.
But that is an incomplete assessment of the use of language.
Mm-hmm.
It ends up by default almost instantly. This is that scene from The Devil's Advocate where he goes, the whole movie is based on a test in one moment, and the outcome of a whole bunch of, I won't ruin the movie. It's an old movie. Most people should have seen it by now. But the minute that test in the movie resolves, he gets tested again instantaneously by the devil. And which we have a tendency to argue in our household is really more just your left hemisphere than the actual being outside of oneself. But all that to say is that that's the best weapon that the left hemisphere has. I once heard someone say that they thought that the very first words that would have been uttered by a human being in a cohesive manner would have been to tell a lie. Because if you're living with honesty and authenticity, very little words need to be said. You would live your life by action and do a thing. This could also be argued why maybe Jesus never wrote anything down. Confucius didn't write stuff down, and not Plato, Socrates didn't write stuff, among others. And I've said this before, and I don't necessarily agree entirely with that, but what it does is it emulates once again the hemisphere's patterns. So you can put that by. I didn't mean to take away from the reading. It was like
No.
it instantly jumped out at me because this is what I mean. Even if you're honest with yourself, and we say on the drilling rigs, hey, it's your lie. You can tell it as big as you want. Well, there's a reason why it's your lie, and you're going to tell it as big as you want because you're lying. And which hemisphere finds value in lying? Well, only the hemisphere that uses language to manipulate and get an outcome. Now, the one thing about the right hemisphere is that it will be permissible. It'll be the absence of no to the lie because there's context behind a lie. Now, it doesn't mean that you agree with why you do it. And I'm not justifying people go ahead and lie. It's to try to understand this flow of why a lie can stay entrenched, and you can build entire religions based on them. You can have your entire culture get built on them. I think that may be one of the things that when Peterson says, well, if you can't tell the truth, then at least don't lie. Taken as a whole, mathematically speaking, which would be the left hemisphere's formula, you're going to produce a better result for your culture, at least not being an open-faced verbal liar, than, okay, it's like that line when somebody's like, they just had a baby and everybody looks at the baby and they're like, oh my gosh, your baby's beautiful. Then you run into those babies that aren't necessarily looking beautiful, and then you say, oh, it looks just like you. It's like, okay, that could be a compliment to the person because most people like to know that their children may look like them, but not everybody looks beautiful. So the baby's still beautiful and its potential is still there, but it might be ugly. I mean, I know that this is being recorded, but this is what it is. And beauty can be in the eye of the beholder, but it's that simple. Like, these are the types of dynamics, the moving target of the hemispheres interplaying with reality. Anyways, we should go back and Macy can take over unless anybody else has anything to say or rebut or to contend with what I just ranted about.
No, it was a really good section. He literally talks about that, and that he describes the Reformation as the era of the triumph of the written word. It's so you transition perfectly, and I think I'll just pretty much go there because I was wondering about this too, as because you have more context about, like, you know more religious history, even as you've read the Bible as many times as you have. Here it is. Macy, do you want to read this for me?
What page is it?
318.
Oh, goodness, I had that open already because I feel like this connects. From where?
Images become explicit, understood by reading.
Okay. Images become explicit, understood by reading a kind of key, which demonstrates that the image is thought of simply as an adornment, whose only function is to fix a meaning more readily in the mind, a meaning which could have been better stated literally. This anticipates the Enlightenment view of metaphor as an adornment that shows the writer's skill, or entertains or aids flagging attention, rather than as an indispensable part of understanding. Sacrament becomes information transfer, writes Coroner. Its material elements convey not substances but meanings, and these later are immutably conveyed regardless of the form they take. In the 20th century, too, we have seen liturgical reformers embrace a view that the meaning is independent of the form, one of the most damaging legacies of the Reformation. Continuing the idea that sacrament has been reduced to information transfer, Coroner continues that this seeming afterthought that Christ's words need explaining completes a sonography of data downloaded from a storage medium. Even the words of sacrament count only if they mean something, for all else serves no purpose. This is the era of the triumph of the written word, and words actually acquire the status of things. I am reminded of Sam Johnson's wise what is this? Admonition that words are the daughters of earth, whereas things are the sons of heaven. In Protestant culture, writes Corner, words acquire the status of things by their aggressive material inscription. A compendium of consoling sayings consists mostly of sayings about sayings. It is fascinating that the way to get the meaning across is apparently to repeat the words endlessly, drumming it further and further into the realm of the overfamiliar, again, the domain of the left hemisphere. For example, the words verbum dimini manet in anternum, the word of the Lord shall endure forever, yet a further element of self-referentiality, became so familiar that it was reduced to the acronym VDMIE. Note that these acronyms start with Roman bureaucracy, e.g. SPQR, and are, I would say, a hallmark of the bureaucratic mind. Look at modern officialdom. The letters VDMIE were embroidered and reproduced endlessly, ultimately becoming, despite the reformers, a totemic apotropaic device, a talisman with the status of an idol, as the refined words in their abbreviated form become the only available thing for the sacred to attach to. As Corner puts it, materialized for display, words become objects of ritual action, a point also made by Chris Rettenbeck. The word freezes into an idol. I would say that the abbreviations, like the impatient reduction to etc., the Lamb of God, etc., betray the boredom and ultimate emptiness that attaches to signifiers that refer only to themselves, that have departed into the realm of the inauthentic through overfamiliarity.
Yeah, that was the section that I related right to what Dad said. And Dad, that reminds me of what Peterson said. He with atheists, he would say people claim to be atheists or secular, yet they still find something else to worship, that now science is their new god. So the same thing happened here, where in pursuit of ultimate authenticity, they rid of traditions and anything denoting Christ or God, because it wasn't the literal thing, even paintings and images, because that was only a re-representation. And then they go to words, and yet they make that acronym a literal. It's basically just the new art. It's the new statue, but now instead of a beautiful statue that somebody put their hard work tears into, now it's an acronym. And it's self-referential. It's the Hall of Mirrors. It's just because, again, why would God, it's word, and I resonated with that line. God's words need explaining. He wouldn't have said them if they didn't have meaning in and of itself. Like, there's a difference between I need help understanding what he said and it needs to be re-explained, because in and of it's just the Hall of Mirrors re-representation. But Dad, you just finished Peterson's thing, so would you have
just to consider the line? We'll let Nathan chime in here, but do you remember the line? It goes without saying.
Yes.
No.
Why does it go without saying?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nathan.
Like in Mark, where it's a parable, and you have to have eyes to see, ears to hear, etc. Just kidding.
Parables are metaphors, right? Like that's why they're offered. They're observable actions throughout time. Because I mean, like even in the Old Testament, right? Like Solomon was considered to be the wisest, right? I mean, that was a bit due to the request, right? Solomon didn't ask for riches or fame when he had his encounter with the Spirit of God or God himself. However you'd like to interpret, pick a Bible, NIV, KV, whatever. But the thing is that the whole point is that what he wanted was a double portion, just like many other prophets of back and throughout the Bible. In other words, I want to be able to have the wisdom to discern my way forward in complex scenarios of life that I can't possibly foresee. Now, that is where there is something even earnest from the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere very much wants certainty. It wants it so bad. If it can systematize it and reduce so that it has it, it will stay in stasis and nothing will change and you'll never grow. Like, period. You'll never grow. But boy, oh boy, you're safe. Useless, but safe. This is where even Freud, right? The eatable mother syndrome. It's like, well, once again, like this is, so you've made safe. Like there's no bravery, there's no courage, there's no exercising something impossibility because something could happen. And that's the part the left hemisphere hates is something could happen. Well, I don't want something.
Not really safe though. I mean, it always ends up.
Of course, right? You're preaching to the choir here. I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. The right hemisphere knows that by instinct. It doesn't even require a vernacular. There's no vernacular required. You're going to be like the chicken. Why did the chicken cross the road? Because whatever it was about the chicken's right hemisphere knew that it had to get to the other side because whatever was there was better than on the side that it was on. You know, so there you go. That's the mystery. The chicken crosses the road. I just solved it. It's done. We can put it to bed. The right hemisphere.
You know what the left hemisphere would do in that situation? It wouldn't even let itself cross the road. It would just go like, it is better on the other side without actually going to the other side.
Oh no, it would manipulate a friend to go across the road to see if it got hit. That's what it would do.
I repeat, if anybody has one, jump. Macy, I see you going towards.
Well, yeah, so it's on there's like two things that I feel like I kind of want to bring up. They're on different pages though. So for now, we'll do 319 because we're already close to that. And it's just the part where it's talking about these different ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen because most of the time when this happens, I start scrolling and then other people see it for me. There's a lot of food for thought here. Even in this part, he talks about how the church, in the Reformation, one of the things they started to do was you don't have to go to a church to connect with God. But McGilchrist said, well then, the church, if the church is now everywhere, the church is into nowhere. Making that statement that you can go anywhere can be holy, it takes away the quality that made the thing holy in the first place, which I do agree with. Where I would find the nuances, that isn't to say that you can't go out into the forest and have something holy and a holy experience there. It's those people that talk about the body being a vessel or the body being a temple and it's holy, but not everything the body does is holy. So you still have to look at a church, look at the quality that makes this church in particular holy, and then you have to find a similar and create the same quality and circumstances in or outside of the church. It's not like anywhere can be holy, but that's not to say that something other than a church can't be holy. That's where I would go a little bit further, but I do think he sort of touches on that. He talks about the quality, but just to take that further, because I when he said that, I didn't immediately resonate that he's like, it's not like anything is beautiful. There are certain things that are beautiful. So it's still acknowledging the quality of the thing that makes it holy is still necessary, though it doesn't have to be in this specific thing, is I think where he doesn't go, but I think he would agree with. That was just a line that this part brought up, and I was like, oh, I wonder what other people would think of that, because I didn't totally resonate when it first, without the expanding that I just gave, I just read it as is. I was like, oh, that's a bit dichotomous.
Well, so holy places. There's a line from a film I was talking about with Kyle today earlier. In the Kingdom of Heaven, the movie, The Kingdom of Heaven, and Saladin is having a conversation, and he's asked the question, like, what is Jerusalem? And he says, nothing. Everything.
Yeah.
And this is where two things can be true at the same time. Because in a lot of cases, this is where the argument against Zionism also plays its role, because there's many who would believe from like Jewish cultures, even in Islam, and quite frankly, even in Christianity, where the God's chosen people are people. And what signifies the chosen people? It is not a race. Like, it's not a race. Okay. If you do any research in the historical manipulations that brought us Zionism, that even brought us like Wahhabite Islam and Sophiism and the fundamentalist Christians, Darbyism and the Schofield Bible and the manipulation of the Book of Revelations and the rapture. These are all manipulations. These are not the authenticity of the pursuit of the most fundamental relationship that a human being can have, and that is their spiritual pursuit and the conduct with which they demonstrate themselves towards other human beings. If you're going to find a chosen people, it's going to be in that conduct. Any conduct that results in killing other human beings, I'm sorry, you're not lining up with what is Jerusalem. Nothing. Destroy it. Rebuild it in our image. No, it's everything. And why is it everything? Because a whole bunch of people see it as holy. They do business there. They live there. You know what I mean? Like this is the distinction between how the left hemisphere would interpret that statement of what is holy versus the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere would be concerned about the community, potential, possibility, and the livelihood of every individual. And the value is intrinsic. It goes without saying.
Yeah.
Left hemisphere, utility, appropriation, manipulation, causation, all for one, more for me. Like, for lack of a better way of saying it, by all means, the whoever it is that I have to step on, hence the boot on the face metaphor in 1984, like, no problem. Because if that gets me where I got to go in order for something good to transpire from that evil, well, I only know one hemisphere that works with that type of dichotomy, that doesn't keep in consideration the nuances of everything also we just mentioned. So that's my way of helping kind of paint that picture a little bit.
Yeah.
It seemed like you got a little bit lost there.
I did. Macy, I found your excerpt.
Oh, okay. I'll just go from it then. I think it'll probably click as to why I'm reading this. It's these different ways of looking at the world, proclamation of the word versus manifestation of the divine, are aligned with hemisphere differences. As Ricoeur demonstrated, the emergence of the word from the numinous is the primordial trait that differentiates proclamation from manifestation. For emergence of the word from the numinous read the triumph of the left hemisphere of the right. At this time, according to Corner, pictures become art, moved out of their living context in worship to an artificial context where they can become allowable and safe with frames around them. Often pictures had literally to be reframed because of the exigencies of smuggling them away from the iconoclasts to safety. Contexts bring meanings from the whole of ourselves and our lives, not just from the explicit, theoretical, intellectual structures which are potentially under control. The power-hungry will always aims to substitute explicit for intuitive understanding. Intuitive understanding is not under control, and therefore cannot be trusted by those who wish to manipulate and dominate the way we think. For them, it is vital that such contexts, with their hidden powerful meanings that have accrued through sometimes millennia of experience, are eradicated. In terms of the conflict that forms the subject of this book, the left hemisphere, the locus of will to power, needs to destroy the potential for the right hemisphere to have influence through what is implicit and contextual. Hence, the Galvanists set about an erasure of the past, involving the destruction of everything that would nourish memory of how things had been, a sort of red revolution that will leave nothing in the church whereof any memory will be. I think I can stop it there, but the reason that I thought that was important is it's highlighting why I guess more so how the left hemisphere operates and its mistrust of the intuitive and the implicit. And it's interesting because in that part where he's talking about the line where it says intuitive understanding is not under control and therefore cannot be trusted by those who wish to manipulate and dominate the way we think, that would be a left hemispheric projection of how it thinks onto the right hemisphere, if that makes sense. And I think that that's why it overcompensates. I think that that's where the inauthenticity accidentally kind of happens with the left hemisphere. Is it might have started in the realm of the right where you were trying to become more authentic, but through through the left hemisphere is like now you've entered in the realm where you're dancing the line of, are you mistrusting though? And then because later on it talks about the fact that it's like what he talked about, millennia of experience eradicated, right? So it's like then this is the problem with postmodernism. There is something where there was tradition in the sense of individuals doing a thing over time, and there was obviously purpose for why it is that they chose to do what they did. And it's the same thing with even when he talks about artists and how in the Renaissance they were becoming heroes at that time and seen as almost very divine people, and their works were like divine. And it talks about it earlier in the book, where we are right now is a bit forward from that, where it says the left hemisphere literally will see almost like artists as possessors of like magic powers, and it'll see those artists as like their ability to connect with almost like what you would call God and the divine in themselves, and then they meet together to create something that is a beautiful work of art. It's like the left hemisphere would see that as like something like that is outside of acting upon the artist, and and then that's why it feels fearful, because it has no control over basically what the artist has, which is imagination, a bit more of that right hemispheric openness to receiving. So again, it goes then into this, and I need to return back to the authentic, but that really just means I return back to my hall of mirrors. I need to return back to what it is I can control. And it also talks about later how in the Reformation, I believe, when it came to certain paintings that might have been allowed, I'm not entirely sure, it just described a scene which varies left hemispheric, of basically like a picture of like where the picture is in its setting. So it's like a picture on the wall, and then it's literally just an a hall of mirrors of that, where it's like, and then it just repeats, where it's like, here's a picture where it's setting, and then it does, here it is again, here it is again, here it is again. It's just this repetitive process. And then I think that that's where why I wanted to talk about that. But yeah.
I have a comment, Macy, about art, because I used to make a lot of art, and it just stopped working for me. I just had to say I don't want to do it anymore. And the reason is, I was trying to force something explicitly,
Mm.
and there was that, but then there was also I looked and looked for an answer, and I felt like the right brand experience is very direct experience, and I came to the I came to a thought or an understanding that why paint mountains when you already have real mountains? you know
That's funny. When he goes into art in the Renaissance, he talks the thing about, first of all, being an artist, the reason why
everybody has different, people have different ways of creating. Some people might want to be an artist, other people might not want to be, what I mean? It's different for different people, are different.
yeah, there's still overarching patterns though. Like who's talking about in the Renaissance, they would discover art on like a flour sack or a rock. These people just, it wasn't on a canvas. These were people that were just called by life to do art. And that's what he said, which is why in the Reformation they started interpreting it, as Macy said, this external thing. The quote is, a myth gave rise to the artists as possessors of magical power. Magic is the way that the left hemisphere sees power over which it has no control. So that's what the mystics would refer to, and that's one of the things that McGilchrist, I understand, romanticizes. He clearly points it out here that magic is the left hemisphere's version of the right hemisphere, yet he'll call mysticism and the Oracle of Delphi this beautiful religious, like, mystical experience. And meanwhile, it's just the right, there's some manipulation that's going on there. So, but regardless of that, artists, most people and I've seen this with a lot of my friends and even my own artist journey, because I do that thing. It's He talked about skills is not something you invent, you discover. You don't invent your talent for art. You can improve upon it, but you didn't just sprout it out of nowhere. You discovered you do art. And that's why there's this describing of something calling to you. And artists tend to, with the mountain comment that you made, he paints this picture how in the Renaissance they can call out nature with their art. It's something where they bring to life aspects that other people didn't notice. And it's not just a re-representation, because it's not the same as a picture. That's why there's this whole, in the Reformation, they were getting rid of all the paintings and all the arts, but there were pictures in frames that they would keep. Because when you paint something, you are now enveloping, as he said with caricature, you are enveloping and bringing forth a new reality. It's a fundamental truth that wasn't necessarily paid attention to before, but the artist has now brought attention, life to the thing. Not to say that it wasn't there, but it wasn't cognized.
Yeah, even the consideration of death is actually a big part of it as well. I forget who the artist is, but there was 4 pictures done of the very same hay bale in a field, and basically watching through the seasons the rotting process of the hay bale. And it was done in, I think it was four frames, but it wasn't 4 frames. It's in A, B, C, and D all happened within one painting project. This artist returned to this particular area to overlook, and this hay bale just hadn't been removed or used for whatever purposes. And at each separate times, there was new flavors to the whole experience. Now, to some, they would look, well, to the left hemisphere would see the utility of a hay bale that didn't get used. What the hell are wrong with those farmers? But to the right hemisphere, it's sitting back looking at the context of, there is this thing that brings life to animals, to creatures who eat it, and the work and the farmers that did the thing. And there it is in this field. And each time that I've cut, it's probably a lookout. It was more, in most cases, I would presume that this artist, this is me doing a little bit of speculating, but I'm going to try to crawl into the mind of a right hemisphere artist, is you find yourself going and returning to a same place. Maybe it's a place that brings you solace. Maybe it's where you go to sit and be melancholy. But while you're there and you look out and you let the world come to you, because this is what the right hemisphere does, then you look and you see a thing and then you paint this thing, but you decide that each time you come back, you paint it and everything's different. The horizon is different with the colors, and the hay bale has changed. The seasons has changed.
Seasons are so big. That's such a big thing.
Of course. See, like there you are going, it's obvious. It's like, no. It's obvious. It's obvious to the right hemisphere. It is not obvious to the left hemisphere. And the thing is like, to what Macy just brought up, and this plays on me because we have, God bless Matthew. He uses intention. He uses intention so much so that I believe that he's forgetting the root underneath the Chesterton's fence. And he's talking about a part of the tree that grows on one side of the fence and the root structure is on the other side of the fence. And as far as I'm concerned, intention is downstream of attention. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to share something, because I've finished the first half of the big tome of Gilchrist's work, but this one plays right into it. So if you guys will just permit me, there's no screenshot. I'm just going to read it to you guys. Because I believe it plays in very much with the theme of tonight's discussion. Attention does not just change things in some rather nebulous way. Attention is responsible not just for the how, though it is, not just for the what, though it is, but as far as the left hemisphere is concerned, for the weather at all of existence. What it doesn't attend to, as far as the left hemisphere is concerned, doesn't exist. Left hemisphere attention is sharply restricted in space and time, which is, after all, the four-dimensional world in which we live. It tends towards precision, but at the expense of depth. It is no longer true to the expansive, always moving, always changing, endlessly interconnected nature of reality. One way of putting it is that the left hemisphere can provide some sorts of knowledge about the world, as it would be scrutinized from a certain theoretical point of view, effectively outside the realms of space and time, as on a map. Whereas the right hemisphere provides us with the knowledge of the world in space and time as experienced. Constraining attention, left hemisphere fashion, makes coherent wholes dissolve and brings things to a standstill. Reality leaches out. The left hemisphere's limited appreciation of depth in space and time is in keeping with its tendency towards stasis. It seems to lack appreciation not just of motion, but of emotion. It relatively lacks appropriate emotional depth or concern, tending to be irritable or facetious, especially when challenged. It tends to disown problems and pass the responsibility to others, is overconfident about what it cannot, in the nature of things, know much about, fabricates, often improbable, stories to cover its ignorance, sees parts at the expense of wholes, tends to see from the outside rather than experience from the inside, and has an affinity for the inanimate or for tools and machines in particular. It is also quite confident it is right.
Mm.
Which you guys have to look forward to when you move on to the next body of work that is not Master and his Emissary. But I think that this plays plays very much into what we've been discussing. Even at Macy Roberts, it's the reason why you will get individuals that will talk about it. We need to return to the authentic version of Christianity, or the authentic version of Islam, or the authentic version of oh, forgive me, I'm doing the Jewish culture no justice right now because I just drew a mind blank. Okay, look, regardless, what ends up happening is that what is it in us that recognizes that there's something inauthentic going on?
Mm-hmm.
See, that's what sets something into motion for the mind to go, right hemisphere in particular, something ain't right. Don't know what that something is specifically, because you need your left hemisphere for that. So you shouldn't be chucking out the baby with the bathwater. We need our left hemispheres to get to the specifics of what is wrong. Unfortunately, what happens is that when the right hemisphere has that tendency to go, something ain't right, we need to return to a sense of authenticity, the left hemisphere goes, okay, I'll look. And when something gets recognized, instead of giving it back over to the right hemisphere for a new contextualization in lived time, left hemisphere goes, oh, this is it. So all we got to do is eliminate this or add on to this. Like, right? A division or a multiplication or an addition or a reduction. Like, that's it. It doesn't understand, well, what will that mean if you do that thing? How does that benefit? Like, what are the consequences of this thing? Like, just there's so many more nuances that the right hemisphere would very much like to have a say in that conversation. But because of the potential, the left hemisphere is like, just, it's almost like, got it. And just, I'm going to go get stuff done. And it's like, okay, fair enough. There is that instinct is necessary. Hunting, right? Kyle and I and Sebastian had our own lived experience with that, where we're like, we could have done a thing and we didn't, because all of a sudden there was rules and stuff like that. But which, fair enough. But just what I'm getting at is we lived a thing, and then we can do nothing but get better with that, and now let the right hemisphere have its say from that point forward. Or you get caught on the left hemisphere's dogmatism of a thing, creates a system, and now we get entrapment. And that's what the Reformation did. That's what the Lutheran movement did. Is then all of a sudden it browbeat. I mean, this is where the term Bible thumping came downstream from the Reformation. And then we should also keep in mind that along this very same path, this happened on several world religions around the world. And we have a certain common empire, British, that manipulated these dynamics for the sake of geopolitical agenda and divide and conquer, which, if I may be so bold, divide and conquer sounds very much like the second most influential thing the left hemisphere ever came up with after sophistry. Sophistry was to use vernacular to betray the right hemisphere and murder it, and then we get the divide to conquer so that it can create its physical reality. And this is what we're going to learn later. Gilchrist sort of, he fires in all sorts of good directions throughout the back half of this book. And when we get into what does the world of the left hemisphere look like, that's like one of my favorite parts of the book, and we're all going to get there together and talk about it because we're in it. Like what the systems being designed. This was 2009, people. This is when we're reading his work, and we're in 2025. Okay, and I'm working on his new books, but just we have to bear in mind that we are now very much downstream of a very left begets left, hall of mirrors, vernacular manipulation, divide and conquer strategies, and it is crushing right hemispheres around the world. We're literally counting on other cultures that have at least a little bit more of the semblance of reality to try to help the rest of us who have lost our way, especially in the West. So I know that's a little off topic from what we're discussing, but I know it plays because this whole journey is us trying to figure out what we are to better negotiate who we are and how to call for help when we need help and how to be graceful leaders when it's time to fill the vacuum.
No, it's even it's I liked this part, and I'll show some images that Macy sent me earlier because when we read this, you alluded to the Lutheran Church, and he does this too. That's the one thing I thought was interesting. He Protestantism, Lutheran, and he referred to all of them as in the progressively bureaucratic takeover that it really is. I'll just read this. It's short and it relates literally to what you just said. Removing the places of holiness and effectively dispensing with the dimension of the sacred eroded the power of the princes of the church, but it helped to buttress the power of the secular state. The capacity for religion to crystallize structures of power and obedience was soon allied under the reformers to the power of the state. Sacred centers thus gave way to centers of attention, writes Coroner, referring to the physical arrangement of the new church interior, in which the focus is no longer the altar, but the pulpit. The Lutheran assembly, despite its emphasis on the word, controlled sight more rigorously than the Roman Catholic Church had ever done. Its emphasis on punishment for departing from the moral law and its panoptical monitoring of the populace are imaged in the exalted position of the pulpit, the place of dissemination of the moral law, often situated at a dizzying height over the heads of the masses near the roof of the church, high above the altar, which tiers of seating for the secular hierarchies in the galleries at the next level beneath, each positioned far over the heads of the obedient populace, ranged in geometric order below. I would note that this geometricity of Reformed churches, the people neatly placed in symmetrical ranks on the floors, which are laid out like graph paper, is highly suggestive of the left hemisphere functioning. So this is a picture of the pulpit. And then Macy sent me some photos of like altars. If they look at this, like, and he meant movement because I think he goes on to continue the left hemisphere. The whole point of this is fixity and stacity, as he says. Altars, you could go and then you would walk around. Like physically, you would actually walk. Like this is movement. Look at how much walking room there is. You go and you explore and you move. It wasn't this thing where they put chairs and now you're all, look at this.
Well,
And that movement too was allowed for so the minute that seats entered into the churches, and I know that there'll be many historians are going to attempt to put me in my place on this, of which of course they can do that thing. They're far more learned, so I will do a Gilchrist. I apologize in certain dynamics. I know that there will be some historical ignorances, but one of the reasons why the earliest of churches didn't do that was congregation is a togetherness and an ability to move and intermingle with one another, and it removes stasis. So, what I mean by stasis is also status.
Yep.
People of a certain birth and nobility then got seated near the front. This is where the whole priority row seating, VIP seating, and all that kind of stuff came downstream of this type of, it's almost like looking at the Prussia school system. And
Yep.
that ended up being downstream and working into, because churches were, there was a movement, there's a sway. It's like watching a grove of trees when the wind works with it, and you watch how they all move and sway together. And if anybody has been a part of a beautiful church ceremony, of which I've been blessed to have many in my life, it's when people decide that there is something more valuable than themselves and each other, but still also have the love for one another and each other, and you are in song, and you're exalting a concept, you're exalting possibility, spirituality, potential, like whether it's Jesus or Muhammad, or like, however you want to play it out. It's like, look at mosques, right? Even though they all have their carpets laid out and whatnot, there's this non-geometric structure about, right? I mean, I know that some would say, well, they went geometric because, you can get more people in the building. But we'll see, once again, that's like utility. You're still working on a utilitarian mindset of what congregation and fellowship is in the pursuit of worship and song and togetherness of community. Because that's also something that the church also brought, was everybody would show up, and there would be, those that you would give alms to, and you would come and do business. Because, I mean, don't forget, it's a big journey for some places to come to church. Like, you're coming from the farmers' fields, you're coming from farther districts, you're seeing people that you haven't seen for like 27 days, because it wasn't every Sunday that you got to the big church in town. Sometimes you'd have your little farm churches, and people would go to do their thing there. Anyways, this is, once again, right, this is all to be kept in mind of the context of the hemispheres playing into the reality of how it plays out, the pursuit of even the religious in the, what I believe Gilchrist is trying to argue as the beautiful pursuit, and then the left hemisphere is utilitarian control manipulation pursuit. And both are evident, I would say, in our culture.
I think that that made me think of something that even when I had so we used to be like, especially my mom and dad you guys were definitely in the church, for those who are listening. But even for some of my own like church experiences, there's a section here that I want to read, because it's an example of how the left hemisphere's mistrust can still, I guess, lead to the exact opposite of what you were talking about, Dad. It's like the exact opposite of communion. And but it was funny because the image that Maddie showed, one of them I picked on purpose, and it was the whole space. It was the second photo. The whole space was so wide, right? And it had so many different avenues that you could go and explore and just go wander and think. And it made me think of like weird Victorian style, like English eras where they are walking through their large properties in the garden. Like they're just walking through their property gardens, and just like poets are thinking as they're walking through. You're having conversations. You're doing the walkabout. But I picked the photo on purpose as well because there were chairs in the front. They were. I think they might have been set up maybe like just by like way later down the line. Like somebody walked into this old church and decided to put down the chairs, but it was in front of the altar. And the cool part though about the altar is the fact that it's like you can be someone sitting in your chair taking a look at what's going on in front of you. And with the pulpit concept, it was basically someone is above you preaching down, and then you're the obedient pleb that kind of just has to take it in blindly and just idly accept it. But with the altar, it's cool because it's literally somebody going up there and just taking their moment, right? Like having their moment to just worship how they would like to, pray if they'd like to. It's like in the film Gladiator, Maximus, he's got his cute little altar that he had, and he's like talking to his wife and his son, and he's just trying to like, he's having his moment. And so it's nice though, because then you get to kind of like bear witness to the next person going up just to have their moment. And that is something that we are sharing. And there's no preaching here. There's just witnessing people taking the time to have that spiritual experience and then that embarks empathy. So I'll just go from here. So Maddie, is it I have emphasized? Okay, I'll go from there. I've emphasized the left hemisphere's inclination towards division, as opposed to the apprehension of connectedness made by the right hemisphere. But there are two types of division and two types of union. In part one, I made a distinction, which is central to the thesis of this book, between two ways of looking at parts and aggregates. In the left hemisphere view, there is at one level the part or fragment, and at the other the generalized abstraction aggregated from the parts. In the right hemisphere view, there is the individual entity in all its distinctness at one level, and the whole to which it belongs at the other. It is, in other words, the special capacity of the right hemisphere both to deliver wholes and to deal with particularities. These are not contradictory roles. It is the special capacity of the left hemisphere to derive generalities. The generalities have nothing to do with wholes. They are in fact necessarily built from the parts, aspects, fragments of existing things, things which, in their total selfhood, individuality, or hacitas, could never have been generalized. Every existing entity comes into being only through boundaries, because of distinctions, which is perhaps why the book of Genesis speaks of God creating by dividing the earth from the heavens, the sea from the dry land, the night from the day, and so on. The drive towards separation and distinction brings individual things into being. By contrast, the drive towards generalization, with its effective democratization of its object, of the holy, of art, of the beautiful, has the effect of destroying its objects as a living force. Coroner draws attention to the bureaucratic categorization that springs up in the Lutheran Church, and, as Max Weber emphasized, in his repeated explorations of the relation between Protestantism, capitalism, and bureaucratization and categorization, with which it is so closely related, is an instrument of power. Perhaps more importantly, Protestantism, being a manifestation of left hemisphere cognition, is, even though its conscious self-description would deny this, is itself inevitably linked to the will to power, since that is the agenda of the left hemisphere. Bureaucratization and capitalism, though not necessarily themselves the best of bedfellows, and at times perhaps in conflict, are each manifestations of the will to power, and each is linked to Protestantism. Weber held that the cognitive structure of Protestantism was closely associated with capitalism. Both involve an exaggerated emphasis on individual agency and a discounting of what might be called communion. An emphasis on individual agency inevitably manifests itself, as David Bakken has suggested, in self-protection, self-assertion, and self-expansion, whereas communion manifests itself in the sense of being at one with others. Agency, he writes, manifests itself in isolation, alienation, and aloneness. Communion in contact, openness, and union. Agency manifests itself in the urge to master, communion in non-contractual cooperation. Success is in material terms became under Protestantism a sign of spiritual prowess, the reward of God to his faithful. I think that like plays really well, because like when I was reading that, I thought of my own experience, but then me and mom were actually just talking in the car today about it, because I read it to her, because I was like, hey, you were a Protestant. And she was like, oh my gosh, I remember back when I was a wee lass trying to convert people, that the whole point was not about communion. It was about, can I convert someone to God better than you can? And she was like, and I thought I was the shit. Like, I thought I was so good at it. Like, no, like, and if someone was better than me, I was going to become better than them. Like, that was right. And so then that is definitely not what communion and what spirituality in the church or any religious like organization is about whatsoever. And it made me think, though, where I remember one time that self-protection thing and self-assertion thing that I was talking about, that also played its role in my world when I was in the church once, because me and Maddie were at I think it was a woman's appreciation night, that was the theme. And then these women, I'm helping cook food in the kitchen, but then they call all the women to the main center. I don't know church slang. Into the room. And then they brought all of us up, and all the young girls were standing in front of the older women, and the older women decided to put their hands on us, and they were just connecting, right? But because I was like peak left hemisphere at the time, I was not embodying the experience. I was so focused on self protection and self assertion that I just thought like it's like that distance. There is a necessary distance to connect with people, but then there is too much of a dissociation. So I kind of dissociated and like not didn't embody the experience, and I was laughing the whole time. Meanwhile, Madison's crying, having a spiritual moment, and I'm here laughing because I'm like, what are they doing? Like, instead of appreciating what it is that their intention downstream of attention was. And that's the problem, because and it's funny because two things are true at the same time. And the reason why I dissociated was because I actually had their context, but it was as we were just reading about, it was generalized and categorized. So what happened is my brain thought, okay, these are Protestants. They pride themselves on converting young people. So my left hemisphere didn't trust their left hemispheres. So I didn't want to embody what they were doing because I was like, oh, look, they're trying to convert me. Not true, but it categorized the entire religious sect of these people instead of their individuality. It's like not every woman standing in that room was trying to, like, they might be, but it's not even the way of which of how they would do it. Maybe some of them might have succeeded because of their authenticity. It's like some of them actually could have genuinely presented an authentic moment of spirituality on me and Madison and those other girls, and they felt it and they meant it, and it was because of the same reason why the initial authenticity as to why they even joined the Protestant religion in the first place. It's like because maybe they were coming from a broken place, maybe like all the context and the nuance as to what right hemispherically brought them to a left hemisphere system. It's like that still doesn't mean that they weren't trying to emanate that towards some of the younger generation, right? So it's just the nuances of who these individual women were is not like we shouldn't necessarily, like I shouldn't have at the time necessarily lumped them in together as all of them are intending to like do this thing, even though it's very likely. It's just like their demonstration at that given moment was not entirely that, and I should have remembered that, but yeah.
Hmm. That was a very funny experience coming because I did I did cry, you know. We were in the kitchen the whole time. Like we were in service mode and then we weren't even a part of the liturgy. It was going on the entire time we were cooking. And so we come in and the last like 2 minutes. So I've heard nothing. I got no context. And then because it's women appreciation, they're like all the young generation come to the front. And then all these women just come up behind, and the lady on stage is just beautiful affirmations and keep goings, and we're in this together, and you're beautiful beings, and I know we all struggle. Just things that everybody can relate to. And all the women are going, yes, Jesus, with their hands. And I'm just, oh my God, I just bawl. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. But it was funny because when we got home, then the overemphasis again about how I was possessed by, like, I felt Jesus, and it just enveloped me, and I got the external forces hit me, and I had a come to Jesus moment, you know, when then it's like in the name of Jesus and the bonk me, and I had one of those moments according to other people. Whereas I was like, I appreciated the energy and the attention that these women were giving because it was literally a women's appreciation night. But this that part doesn't just relate to religious experiences, because talking about agency, that is also, again, this is something Peterson brings to with all those the atheists out there, especially people of, you know, the younger generations, where they don't really have, if they don't have a historical knowledge of religion, they don't have a personal knowledge either. The God crisis, the existential crisis, doesn't really happen the same anymore. And but this concept is still relevant because today you got to be independent. You got to be, you know, self-sustaining, and you're out of the house at 18 and stuff like that. And they emphasize agency, which is what even though you're an atheist, now it's, as McGilchrist pointed out, now it's the secular, it's the state saying you need to um, be a self-sustaining agent. Whereas, and that's how I felt when I was younger. That was my goal. And then as I got more and I started to understand the family dynamic better, that whole idea of communion, it did take it away because it does a self agency did feel alone and it felt isolated, all the things he described. Whereas once you incorporate into the whole, in my case, my family, that idea of communion, that made sense. All of this talk about the Reformation and him putting the religious context, I didn't grow up as religious as my parents, but I can relate to absolutely everything they're talking about. One, because it's a hemisphere thing and we all have hemispheres, but two, because it's just generally the human experience. And so you can apply it to fields outside of religious because the religious experience can be the human experience generally. And that was the one thing that this whole thing, because the first time I read it, it went over my head. Now that I'm actually reading it for the second time, because I didn't understand the religious connection, the existential thoughts, and or the religious background, the significance of the pulpit versus the altar, and all of those connections. But unless Macy, you have another screenshot, we are 10 past the hour.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was actually just thinking of one last tiny thing. I don't know if it connects. It's going to be a little bit of a wrecking ball, but not entirely because it's still part of the chapter. So, but it was this part that I thought was actually important as well, just for people who are like listening. Is there was a section in this book where Gilchrist talks about kind of like when we started becoming a bit more self-aware, before we got a little bit to the self as an objectified thing, when we started to get self-aware in the sense of like really empathizing with another person because we felt like we could distinct ourselves just enough actually to reach them. When that happened, there was an individual he was describing where he said that this person was so empathetic and so, I guess, one with who it is that they were connecting with, that he felt pain and physical pain and like just literal pain when he saw his loved ones with a sickness or an illness. And he said that I was more apt and inclined to help random strangers than I was my loved ones because I couldn't bear being in the same room as them because if one of them coughed, I felt the pain in my lungs. It's like, so it's just, so when I thought of that, I was like, okay, so there can be such a thing as you're so right hemispherically minded, you're no left hemisphere good. And that was the example in my brain because I was like, well, dude, if your family's not doing well and they're sick, you need to get in there. What are you talking about? It hurts too much. Like you gotta get it. So which is so fair. But then that's where you do need to have that emissary come in and be like, sir, you need to attend to this. It's like they need help. So, and it's still like encompassing of the motivation of the right hemisphere, which is like it would be inclined to want to help, but then how are you going to do it? It's like you need to turn off I guess the really empathic part of you. You need to turn off, like dial down a little bit, and you need to get something done to actually help out your loved ones. So I just thought that would be something as well that people should consider.
There's nuances to that too, because you'll see this very common, especially amongst men, but I know that it's not foreign to women. But just given even my time on the drilling rigs and the hundreds of guys that I worked with, when they were dealing with loss, whether it was, the one like either they lost their wife or maybe a child or something had transpired in their lives, work became the necessary means for them to be able to transcend the empathetic and emotional hardship and trauma that was experienced.
Yeah.
The left hemisphere set up a system because the rig and the routine and the hierarchy gave them a little purpose, because the minute that they weren't in that little purpose, then they were needing to map right? Like, because when you face with trauma, this, I mean, there's lots of individuals that do work on this. I mean, we can go to the Petersons and the Gadsheads and Jonathan Haidt and McGilchrist, but then we can also go to I mean, you can even see it in good scientists, Kepler and whatnot. Like when you were faced with a problem and it is now getting beyond, which most cases it will be, the left hemisphere, because the left hemisphere only knows what the right hemisphere has offered it.
Mm-hmm.
And then even at that, it's always going to systematize it, reduce it, control it, manipulate for its purposes, right? Build me an empire without a tape measure. The answer is you can't. And I don't mean empire in the evil way. I mean even like good infrastructure. Like good. You cannot build a nuclear reactor without the left hemisphere. Now, all that to say is that plays into the more philosophical versus like the hemisphere one for one, because the one thing about the hemispheres is they are like just they are and they will be. There's no removing the agency of the hemispheres, whereas the outcome of the hemispheres dance, right, when they flow and they run in symbiosis. Now we're getting into statements of, well, you're so heavenly minded, you're no earthly good, or you're so earthly minded, you're no heavenly good.
Mm-hmm.
This is a downstream. That's where intentions based off attention and
Mm-hmm.
which hemisphere is getting the attention. Is it
Mm-hmm.
the 30% of the left hemisphere, or is it the 70% of the left hemisphere? Like, and then vice versa. You can flip the script on it, because there's something to be said. There are individuals that will literally be able to carry themselves through their lived trauma because they gravitate to the left hemisphere system of routine. But
Yep.
So in our family, our way of staying and dealing with this, and hopefully this will resonate with people out there that are following the work that we're doing. And it's, we often say this is like, if you're angry about something, it's perfectly rational. You can't stay there. If you are sad about something, it has its place, but you can't stay there, because if it's the one thing that you can guarantee, the left hemisphere promises you stasis.
Mm-hmm.
So you've experienced a trauma, and that trauma could be something you did. Okay. And now all of a sudden you're having to build another map on a crime that the left hemisphere propagated, and the right hemisphere wants to bring it into context, and the left hemisphere is refusing the context. I mean, like, we have enough evidence of that right from the showing the left hemisphere its arm, and it literally would be like, that's not my arm, that's my mother's arm. It was hidden under the laundry on the other side of the room of the bed, and I don't even know why it would be there. Like, we have this evidence. So now this is something that we physically do. So when you find yourself in that place where you are allowing your left hemisphere to dominate your growth as an individual to the point where you are now not correlating where you are in reality in the midst of the map that the left hemisphere sees the world in, Houston, we have a problem. And that's what these conversations are about. And that's my 2 bits on that dynamic. If we don't get this, if we are in a position to take, like, think about this. Gilchrist has offered something in his work, and we are correctly ripping it apart. And I do mean ripping as in the beautiful version of the thing.
Mhm.
Right? We're causing a dissemination in order to, it's like building a ladder which needs rungs, and it's the different stencils, like the different pieces that make a ladder, because we're trying to transcend and bring both our hemispheres along with us. So that way, somewhere along the way, we are allowing a better, and we're believing, this is faith, we are believing a better version of ourselves
Mm-hmm.
to be shown as inept as we are right now. Because wherever it is that we get to next, whatever plateau of the potential and possibility, even throughout the literature studying that we're doing and the conversations that we're having, it is inevitable that we will find ourselves with a new failure, but it's a new failure,
Mm-hmm.
which means that now that we have all sorts of new possibilities to transcend. Right now, we are living in a place and a culture where we are swimming in our own feces. We are the dog spiritually that returned to its vomit. We are in a very bad toilet bowl swirl right now. And if we don't find our way through this with our minds in check, to count that whatever it is that's going to be next, we won't find it. Somebody will, maybe not who's here in the room and who even watches this. I know without a shadow of a doubt it will be found, because we have cultures that are still trying to hold on to their humanity, with the potential of seeking the 75-25 or the whatever 80-20, 60-40. I don't care. Ratio is required by the left hemisphere. I'm not really good at that stuff.
Rationalization.
Right.
No, I think that was a perfect way to lead us into sustained attention, because that was a pretty good encapsulate dad of the whole discussion. I'll start because I have something on the forefront of my brain, and it's one of the I don't remember where this patient study came from. Right, it was an interview with McGilchrist that Macy had watched, and it was a schizophrenic patient, and they said, I am missing something that most people have and humanity has, and I'm just missing it. I know I don't have it. That is a beautiful recognition, again, of the hemispheres cognizing itself over this whole chapter and this whole part two. And as Dad said, the hemispheres, they will play out regardless of us paying attention to them. And this person, a schizophrenic patient, knows that they are missing something. And that just goes to show these universal fundamental things that are happening around us and in us. And it's up to us to then learn them, because they're gonna happen regardless. And the fact that this person knows that they have something wrong, that means we know when there's something right. If we can identify that there is something off, we know that there's something better. And that is where people are starting, I believe, is where we are as a culture, is that people are starting to realize that there are things wrong. And that's the beautiful thing about the hemisphere work, is that everybody knows it without knowing it. That's why it's everywhere. It's not as simple as, oh, I've started looking through things. I've studied finances a bit more, so now I'm recognizing more financial things. This is a universal, because it's the brain. This is universal across human history. And as we are here and we are exploring history and humans, this is the thing that will help us get through all of the cycles that are going here on forth. And that is one thing that is really, really prominent within my soul. Nathan, do you want to go next?
All right. So one of the things, the value of reading this book is I've actually lived the experience of, to some degree, an awakening, and then a kind of a difficulties, and a holding grudges, not forgiving people at all. I mean, I'm seriously a grudge holder, like, bad. I mean, that's the mind, that's the left brain. And it just relates to the Reformation, very much so. And it's like, I've always had a lot of heart. And how that works is, with intentional suffering, and I could be wrong about this, but the pathway back to that frozen place inside myself has to be done intentional suffering, walking back through the decisions of my mind that I've made, the traps that I created to imprison myself with my left brain. I can intentionally go back through them with my heart and feel not go back into the past, but just simply go back into the actual intentional suffering of it. And it's not going to be fun. It's not fun, because it's like, well, what about moving forward? What about being in the moment? What about all of it? You could do both. But one thing is, there has to be a differentiation between the brains as the intentional suffering goes on to a place where the heart froze because of pain, because of hurt, because of all these things, whatever it is. And because I do have a heart, I can do that. I can address things in the body that are not necessarily to do with reality. emotions, things like that, and explore them and see how did I process this in a way that is, as McGilchrist shows, ensnared me and trapped me. Because what we're dealing with in our emerging cultures is a separation of functionality and our right brain, but imprisoning our right brain with the functionality because the fear is baked into the system, into the AI, into all of that. And that's what we might have to experience. But we have all of those things that they can in the explanation of its application. We have that inside of ourselves, and we can actually creatively unite and explore our Christ consciousness together in a way that there even that cannot surmount our creativity. Okay, that's my.
Macy, you just
Don't push
volunteered yourself to go next.
I am glad because honestly, I think that what Nathan said was really, really fantastic. And I think that I have, being young, it's really funny because I can relate a lot, right? So it's just like the hemispheres, even age is important to consider, right? But it still is like an overall pattern depending on your proclivity of what it is that's going on. So when you're talking about kind of like those internal conflicts, and then trying to kind of go back and take a look at your context to see how it is that you operated then, how it is that you're operating now, and the evolution of yourself. That is something that is so important, and because that's time, and we know that that's what the right hemisphere specializes in, is that you need to remember your own context and remember the time. But it's also interesting to remember in the sense of trying to figure out your relationship with yourself, but also with other people. Because I remember I was going, like, you were talking about holding grudges, and I was having an issue with someone, and they said something that provided additional context for me to consider that I wasn't. And then, of course, like, because I have the ability to have my mind changed, I was like, oh, okay, so that's definitely like something I should have considered, but I didn't. But then what I did is I felt so bad about the fact that I didn't consider that, and that I put all the weight on myself, the responsibility. I just put it on me because I didn't want to put it on that other person, because I felt I'm the idiot who didn't consider these things. But then they did something though where it's just like I felt like I was holding a bit of a grudge, because two things happened during that interaction. Was I fucked up, but also they fucked up, and it hurt my feelings as well. But I was trying to go back into the, I guess, hypotheticals of my brain, and thought, if I interact with this person again, what am I gonna do? Like, how am I gonna move forward? And I thought to myself that there are the context of the overall relationship is something that is important in playing in your decisions of how you're going to interact with other people. Because when I was thinking about it, I was like, well, I could just try and maybe re-explain where it is that I was coming from to, maybe bridge that gap, and perhaps I could. But another part of me also thought that I need to meet them where they are, and I need to meet myself where I'm at in that moment. It's like, if it ever was to occur again, it's like I'm not where I was when that interaction and that confrontation happened anymore, and neither would that person be. You would hope. So it's like, if you can meet them with that authenticity of like, hey, where are you now? Where am I now? In the grand scheme of trying to get into the legalities and logistics, we could. And I thought I'm the type where I'll do both. I'll think about it, but I'm also, can you do what I think would be a right hemispheric thing to do, which is the forgiveness aspect. It's like, can you do forgiveness for the sake of the whole, And because overall, is this relationship still something that is more important than the tiny little peculiarities? Yes. Is it important to understand those peculiarities, though? Yes, because we're talking about the hemispheres in general, and part of the peculiar is, part of the universal can be found through the peculiar, right? So it's like, it is still important to take your time to assess. But then the next question is, is it for you then, or is it for them? It's like when you're going into this interaction, are you doing it for you or for them? Are you learning this information about yourself for someone else or for you, right? And then because that's that part of like what can you hold that is your own that you don't necessarily just have to hand out all willy-nilly. It's figuring out what am I going to do for me. So that was just something that my brain thought of. And another like last little things, I've been ranting a little bit, that I thought of as well was I was having like, if you want to call it a little mini, I'm not even in my midlife, so like quarter crisis, where I couldn't sleep because I was too busy thinking about, funny enough, the schizophrenia. And I was thinking, oh, I have very similar tendencies to schizophrenia in some sense. And because I've just been deep diving into the realm, so of course I'm going to start finding and relating myself to it. And then I thought, oh no, what if I develop schizophrenia? I know it sounds retarded, but I'm not even joking. I did this thing. It made me think of the sense where it's like some hypotheticals are good to go down for the potential of what could be learned. But then there are some where, honestly, if you're not taking in context, you will get lost. And that's exactly what I'm the type of person where I would get lost if I went down that realm of letting the hypothetical of that fear-based scenario happen. So what I did is I reverse correlated and I went back to context where it was like, how many times, nine times out of 10, I don't worry about turning into a schizophrenic. I live my life. I keep pursuing my goals and all is good, you know? So it's just, can you come back to base where it's just like, what do you in reality do though? Like watch yourself. And then also intention is downstream of attention, right? So it's like, so my intention is still not to stop pursuing what it is that I'm pursuing and then trying to link it with what it is that I can. And so it's like all is well in that sense. So that's kind of where my sustained attention was. It's like just relating it back to the lived process that is you, because that is what we read about later on is the left hemisphere can take away the yourself as the concept of you and the actually no the essence of you and the being of you as a living force. So yeah, that was long, sorry.
That leaves Kyle to take us home.
Okay. It's cool doing especially the second half of this book for the second time on the second read through because you know where he's going to try and take you through the rest of it. And so like as we get further and further into our second half here, you get to see clearer and clearer the problem that McGilchrist is trying to solve of this pendulum situation that keeps happening. And so you see your ancient world flip from it right to left, and then you get to your Renaissance, and once again, he's gonna explain how it swaps back over to the left, and then near the end of this half of the book, we know he's gonna go into what would a left hemisphere predominated world look like going forward, and it's like a what like 12, 13-year-old book, and it's pretty much a bell ring of what we see today, and so it makes me wonder like how far along the pendulum swing are we now? And
Hmm.
what would a right hemisphere resurgence look like today? Because I don't think it would manifest in an immediately recognizable way because we have the benefit of looking back at so much history and pulling that pattern out of decades and centuries. And so if it were starting to emerge now, one way or the other, because we could still be on the left hemisphere hasn't reached its apex before it maybe swings back the right way. What would the right hemisphere resurgence look like if it were to come? And I know McGilchrist also says he has a fear that it is possible that the left hemisphere could reach such a powerful point that it pendulum will break and won't swing back the other way. But I can't really subscribe to that because as long as there's people left, there's still right hemispheres. And so I still think that there's potential because wherever you see people, there's nothing but potential for good or for bad. We'll make our judgments as we go. But, I still think there could be a positive pendulum swing. It just takes fucking work.
With that, yeah, that was a good mic drop. Thank you for coming, everybody. I will send out emails again when this is, rescheduled. Everybody, links in the description for any links alluded to, and to buy the book so you can join our journey or start your own journey. So yeah, everybody, goodbye. Thank you.
Do svidania.
Thanks,
До
guys.
свидания.
Yeah.